Welcome to Life Happens, where Texans come to protect their legacy and prepare for the second half of life. Join your host, attorney Kim Hegwood of Your Legacy Legal Care, and our weekly guest as we navigate the challenges that emerge as life happens. Now here's your host, Kim Hegwood.
Good morning and welcome to Life Happens with me, Kim Hegwood, and my very special guest is David Gober with Capstone Hospice and Home Care. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Kim?
I'm doing great. I tell everybody I woke up today, so it's going to be a good day.
Yes, ma'am.
So today we're going to talk about some of those topics that unfortunately have a lot of myths about them. So we're going to be talking about demystifying hospice, and I will tell you, I was one of those that was totally, 20 years ago, had no idea what hospice did versus what I thought it did. And so, so I'm going to let you tell our listeners what are the most misunderstood aspects of hospice, because I think probably some of them are the ones that I had back in the day too.
Sure. And it's a scary word, hospice, for a lot of people. They hear that word, they instantly go to, nightmare scenarios and worst case. And it doesn't really have to be that way. Hospice is an incredible benefit. I think that we deserve to give our government and Medicare a lot of credit for doing something right. And hospice is one of those wins that was achieved. It's been a process over the last 20 to 30 years to really make hospice into what it is. And it's a big win for families when they're able to acquire it. And some of the big misunderstood aspects of it is, one would be the idea that by choosing to utilize this service, that somehow that is a death sentence for mom, that somehow that hospice is going to be totally hands off, or they're going to exacerbate the situation, or they're going to somehow move that timeline up. And the one thing that I'd like to make sure that our folks know really early in the conversation is that it's mostly your parents that are calling the shot. It's the elderly mom or dad. They're the ones who are calling the shots. And a good hospice company, which is most of them out there, let's be honest, are going to just come alongside them and meet them where they are. They're the ones who have the issue it's something that's kind of bringing them down, and the hospice company is going to be meeting them where they are and trying to make them as comfortable as possible in the midst of that. So if they have a timeline, and we all do, we all have a timeline. We're all on an XY graph, for with a final date attached to us. Choosing to utilize this service does not change that final date. It doesn't change whatever that date is. That is our last day on earth. The choice to utilize hospice doesn't change that. And that's kind of something that I would really want everybody to know. That's a pretty misunderstood aspects of things. It doesn't mean that all of care is going to cease when you choose to utilize hospice, that all medical interventions cease. It simply means that we're going to focus on quality of life, and getting an infection is not good quality of life. Hospice is going to continue to treat those things. Injuries are terrible quality of life. Hospice is going to deal with those injuries and continue to treat them. So I wouldn't want folks to think that because we're utilizing hospice that suddenly all medical care ceases. It's a different avenue for medical care, and it's a slightly different philosophy, but it's still very hands-on.
So I'll confess, David, that before when I first thought, my grandmother was going to need hospice, I was thinking, oh, they're going to come in and take care of her like a 24/7 kind of thing, So, and evidently I wasn't the only one that thought that, and still today probably not the only ones that thought that. And I'm like, oh, it was a little rude awakening, and but we were blessed because she was in a lot of pain, and so the pain management that they did kept her very comfortable. And so for us, it was a blessing, for that, because they came in and they checked on her and did all those things. So,
That's right.
So, just really understanding how hospice works, because we have, I know of stories, probably you, that they get on hospice and then maybe a year or so later, they're off because they're better.
Yeah, we call that graduating.
They graduate in the good way,
That's right. In a good way. That's right.
Yeah, they graduate out and not, So,
That's right.
so that's
That's
always
right.
important, I think, for people to know, is that, it's an extra level of care that people could really benefit from. And so
Yeah.
how does someone know truly when it's the right time for hospice? Because I think a lot of people wait too long.
Sure, sure. And I agree with that there's a philosophical readiness for hospice. There's really two components to readiness. It's a philosophical component where you are as a family in terms of accepting the decline of your loved one, versus a medical readiness that you've got to actually qualify for the service based on objective ideals as to what qualifies somebody for a hospice service. From a philosophical standpoint, qualifying for hospice is about accepting that there's a culprit, there is a diagnosis that is likely going to take your loved one's life at some point. Hospice generally requires there to be one of those. And philosophically, we're accepting that we're no longer going to be fighting that ultimate culprit. It can be cancer, could be things like COPD, untreatable things like Parkinson's, uncurable things like those diseases that are, obviously associated with the elderly, with end of life, but any of us could be subject to at any point. And philosophically, it's about recognizing, accepting that we're all made with obsolescence. We're all going to decline, and at some point, there comes a time in which it's no longer value added to continue fighting this disease process. We simply want our loved one to be comfortable. I would want somebody to have made that crossover with guidance, with counseling, before I would ever consider suggesting hospice for them. That they need to make sure that they as a family are okay with the fact that all of us are going to die, all of us are going to pass along one day, and our loved one may simply be in that place where we need to accept the disease process and allow that to play out. So that's a philosophical part. From a medical standpoint, they have to have declined, and they have to have a diagnosis that has achieved a certain level of decline, that has gotten them over a certain imaginary line to the point where they can utilize this service. And a lot of people return to that 6-month time. I think most folks will be familiar with a 6-month. All that really means is that a hospice decision maker, it can be a nurse practitioner, it can be a doctor, have determined that there is a reasonable possibility that there is 6 months of life remaining. Now, that doesn't mean that anybody has a crystal ball. Doesn't mean that anybody knows what the next 6 months are going to look like. And oftentimes, with good quality of life, that timeline continues to go further out. And everywhere along the way, they're continuing to recertify that there's still a 6-month possibility remaining, which is why somebody can remain on that service for sometimes a couple of years, because all along the way, there was always that 6-month possibility. So nobody's declaring that, yes, in fact, your loved one only has 6 months of life remaining, but that possibility is there, and that's important and necessary for Medicare to get somebody qualified for the service. And when those two things align, when you got a philosophical component and you've got a medical readiness, then the right time is there, and everybody is usually on the same page about it.
Perfect. But if I decide to use hospice, can I change my mind?
Sure. You mentioned graduating, right? That's the idea. We call that when somebody has really come out of the hospice window. There's a lot of disease processes out there that the body can either fight off, that even though we were accepting of the disease process in the beginning and we accepted the hospice service, things change. The body continues to heal. Things can get better. A good example is stroke recovery. That when somebody has a severe stroke, that instantly qualifies them to receive the service. But with modern medicine and great physical therapy and things that can continue to happen, then somebody could come out of that stroke window and graduate from hospice. Well, the same thing is really true for you in deciding your loved one. How you care for your loved one and the decisions that need to be made are purely your own. And whoever that decision maker is, oftentimes it's the patient themselves. They may decide up front that they're ready to receive end-of-life benefits, but then they change their mind. They might decide, you know what, I do want that chemotherapy after all. I do want that invasive surgery. And that can happen very, very easily. At that point, it's a decision just as easy as changing your doctor. It's a decision to revoke the service. And then you can always come back to it after the fact. And that's very, very common, especially with treatable situations that are unexpected. Sometimes, say somebody has an issue that is unrelated to their primary diagnosis. Maybe it's an injury or a fall of some kind, a broken arm or something, where your hospice provider is not going to be prepared to do an x-ray or maybe set a bone in the house. You're going to need to go to an ER and get that treated. And that would be a hospice revocation, which is really not that big of a deal. And then you could come back on the service after that treatment is received.
Awesome. That's good information. And so what's the one thing you would want everyone to know about hospice?
You mentioned earlier about caregiving, and that's a really important thing that I would really want to make sure that everybody understands the difference between the hospice provision versus what we call ADLs. And I know that your audience is probably familiar with activities of daily living, which are outside of the scope of a medical provider. So hospice is a medical provider. It's very much like accepting a new doctor, accepting a new general practitioner. And sometimes those doctors come to you, sometimes you go to them. Hospice is one that always goes to you, and it is a medical provision, which means that the goal of hospice is to make sure that your medications stay lined out, that you're getting the right things on time, and ultimately that the system to take care of your loved one is achievable, that everybody has a role to play. But ultimately, the caregiving aspect of a hospice patient still falls on the family to be the primary providers of care. Now, oftentimes they delegate that role to a paid caregiver or a service that can come into the house, or they might be in an assisted living facility. Most assisted living facilities are not really prepared for one-on-one 24-hour supervision for a dying person. They might be set up to provide you a good environment for it, but the family is going to need to be prepared that as the activities of daily living, as those needs continue to increase, then the family is going to need to be prepared to supplement either via their own labor or through outside caregiving. Now, there are, a few exceptions to that, or a few ways in which hospice kind of helps in that area. Hospice provides all of your continence products, provides all of your medical equipment and a hospital bed, and all of those can really assist with caring for the loved one if you have the right tools in place. And also hospice provides somebody to give a bath. To correct hygiene is so important to somebody's quality of life and so important to comfort that's one area in which hospice kind of crosses over into the ADL space, and all hospices will do that. So that's really what I think the most important thing that I would want folks to be prepared for is that as their needs of their loved one increase, the family and their caregiving situation is going to have to step up into that gap with assistance and guidance from the hospice team.
Cool. And so how does one hospice provider distinguish itself from another, and how do you choose?
There are many hospices in most locations around the country now. There's a lot of different options. Families have full right to choose, and they don't even most of the time know that they can choose their own provider. And that's really important to know that for the most part, families have freedom to choose, especially when we're talking about Medicare situations. You really have the entire suite of hospice companies in your geographic area that you can choose from. Hospices distinguish themselves primarily, in my personal opinion, by the interaction personally with you. That's it. It's really about your connection, your ability to have symmetry with that provider. From a philosophical standpoint, there may be a religious connection that you can connect on. There might be simply a personality that you can connect with. So a family has the freedom and perhaps even the responsibility to interview multiple companies and to talk to their nurses and talk to the hospice liaison that's going to be kind of helping to make the match, and to basically interview different hospice companies to make a decision. Most of the time when you're coming from a medical situation, a discharge of some kind, most of the time there's guidance there. They've already got a few hospice companies that they can narrow things down to. But you could call anybody that you want that's in your general geographic area, and they're going to be prepared to send somebody out to meet you. So I would really suggest that families really make a connection with a hospice company. The other really important thing to know is that hospice companies have different philosophies about the amount of service that they can provide above that minimum standard that Medicare provides. There's certainly a minimum standard, but a good hospice company should really be able to do better than that. Visiting your loved one in an increasing number of times per week as your loved one declines, providing that aid at a timely manner, providing those products whenever you need them, being available 24/7. Those are all really basic provisions of hospice, and most good hospice companies will provide that. There's a big distinction, I think, between a large company and a small company, and both have advantages and disadvantages. A big company may have bells and whistles. They might have a full-time music therapist, and they might have pet therapy, and they may have these things, and that can be really great, at the expense of maybe knowing who's in charge and feeling like you've got a real connection to the leaders of the company. Whereas a smaller family-owned company in your area might be willing to meet with you personally in terms of the ownership and really feel like you've got direct access to the decision makers and the leaders of that company, which most people find very valuable as well. So I'd say that there's a really, without getting into too much detail, those are the real big distinguishing ideas. Is really kind of the large versus the small, and kind of which way you want to go. Is very similar to your previous conversations you've had on your program about personal care homes versus large assisted living. It's very similar in mindset to that as to how you pick a hospice provider.
Perfect. That's good information. And so, because I imagine a lot of families don't think about all those things when they're thinking, about it as well. And so, and a lot of times the hospital says, hey, or the doctor's office says, hey, this is who you call, so
Right.
you're like, oh, okay, thank you, and they don't think about the fact that they can get someone else. And
That's
so,
right.
so that's good. I know with my grandmother, the doctor's office said, call this person, call this company. That's who we did, didn't even think anything about doing anything else, so
Right.
that's really good information because a lot of families would like to have choice,
Yes, ma'am. That's
so.
right.
Now, if I think, that Capstone Hospice might benefit, one of my loved ones, how do I get started?
Well, we need to get over both of those hurdles that we discussed earlier, that we need to make sure philosophically that everybody is ready for hospice. And if the loved one is capable of participating in that conversation, then they need to be included in that conversation. Oftentimes they're not. Oftentimes they're not capable of participating in that conversation, especially regarding dementia and the elderly. But if they can talk about hospice, then that loved one needs to be involved in the conversation. A good hospice provider can help you with that conversation and how to broach that topic with your loved one. So getting started is a lot of talking. It's about understanding the benefit, understanding the service, making sure that we're all in agreement that this is the right way to go. There are sometimes medications that are directly treating and trying to fight that diagnosis. So understanding that those might need to be discontinued or recommended to be discontinued by the hospice company. And so being on board with that and understanding all of the questions that getting your questions answered ahead of time. Then there's the other aspect of making sure that there's a medical justification for hospice in the first place, that a hospice provider, their role is to make that decision and to determine whether this person is medically qualified. It is not ever the family's role to have to do that. You simply get guidance. You're getting guidance from all of the experts and resources that are all around you. They're pointing in the right direction. They'll probably connect you with a company, hopefully like Capstone Hospice. And then it's our job to ask the right questions and to determine whether this person is medically qualified. It begins with receiving the most up-to-date medical records available. And that's very, very basic. Sometimes there are obvious culprits that are going to qualify somebody immediately. And if they have a diagnosis of things like COPD and Parkinson's, cancer, then those things are going to relatively quickly qualify somebody for the service. In addition to that, we're going to talk through any other remaining details about where this person is going to live and is going to receive that service. Again, the hospice team simply wants this loved one to be totally cared for and get their ADL needs met wherever they live. And unfortunately, we're not able, that's not something that Medicare has determined that crosses over into the hospice space. but we are going to help the family figure that question out. That oftentimes there's a step change in how much care somebody needs, and we're going to be provided a leading that conversation to make sure that wherever your loved one lives, that they're going to be getting that care. And then, so we receive the medical records, we validate, we validate this person qualifies for the service, and then we receive an order from a third party. Any doctor that has seen your loved one can provide an order that allows us to evaluate this person for hospice. And then it's a decision that the family needs to make. And oftentimes, as you can imagine, this happens extremely quickly. The hospice was not on the radar until it is, and then all of a sudden things happen really, really quickly. So, the good news about starting early is you get time for that education, and you get time to ask all your questions. And, God willing, you're not waiting until you feel like you're in a position of crisis and that you've got to get a hospice company in here yesterday. And so that's the goal, is to really have, kind of stay ahead of the game, even though we certainly have no control over our loved ones' health. And oftentimes we're at the mercy of the health that we simply have to trust the Lord in that. We don't have control over these things. That's what we do. But ultimately, that would be the best possible approach, is to receive medical records early and have plenty of early discussions. And then within a matter of days, we're all in agreement that we're ready to do an admission. And then your loved one is now on service.
Perfect. And so, all right, David, if somebody wants to find you, how do they find you?
We are Capstone Hospice, small mom and pop company, Northwest Houston. We're located in the Jersey Village area, but we service a broad radius from there all the way through downtown, all the way up to the Woodlands, east and west, as you can imagine, all the way out in Katy and to the east. So we're very easy to find, and we are excited to take your call and help answer any questions you have, even if it's just about hospice. Our website is capstone-health.com, and my personal email address is david@capstone-health.com. And we'd love to hear from you on our phone number, 281-204-2695. If you're in the Houston area, even if you feel like you might be outside of our radius, I would be glad to just help you answer your hospice questions, and I can point you in the right direction if that's something that you'd be interested in.
David, that's phenomenal. And I appreciate that immensely, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. And I just want to thank you so much for being on the show, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you very much, Kim. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Life Happens with Kim Hegwood. Be sure to tune in every Thursday at 10 a.m. wherever you listen to your podcast, as we navigate through the challenges that emerge as life happens. The content of this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship or constitute attorney-client privilege, legal, medical, financial, or any other professional advice.